Back again with another tier list with the tier list magician himself, Dratnos. Today, we're going to be bringing you guys the 10.1 raid DPS tier list. There's been a decent amount of raid testing. There's been less Mythic Plus testing than we had coming into 10.0. But even still, it seems like there's actually a lot of very interesting positions. I feel like there hasn't been that much of a shakeup in regards to where everything is placed, but there are definitely some specs that have moved up or down a couple of tiers due to new tier sets, different class tuning. But I think by and large, we just come off one of the most interesting patches balance-wise for DPS that we've had in a while.
Yeah, I think a feature of the 10.0 patch cycle was that Blizzard did a really good job of nerfing most of the specs in S and some of the specs in A, buffing a bunch of the specs in D and C, and really bringing everything towards the middle of the pack. So we're still going to use all of these different tiers in our list today, but I think it is worth noting that compared to like some Shadowlands patches, I think the gap between S and D is a lot smaller than it used to be, that's great. That's really good for the health of the game.
For DPS, there's been a decent amount of criticism about the amount of class tuning that we've received. This has definitely been one of the lower ends of class tuning that we've received, just generally. So that's something
over the PTR cycle.
Over the course of the PTR cycle, yeah.
Yeah, which I think there's an argument to be made that they didn't need to do that much, but I mean, I think there are still a few outliers, but we'll have to see how it goes out. Now, of course, this is a tier list video. Tier list videos are entertainment, right? That's it's fun to talk about what's good in the game. It's interesting. If you're using this to decide what to play, you should be probably basing that based off of your own takes rather than, us two idiots, what we think is good. And certainly if you're using it to like tell other people what to play, that is a ridiculous failure in the usage of the tier list. Tier list is for fun, because it's great to talk about what's good in the game and, get each other's opinions on these sorts of things, and also sort of put our rankings where we think they're going to be. This tier list is also based off of, raid testing, the most recent set of class tuning that's happened after the raid testing finished. So we're making some guesses based off of that, which means it's a very limited information set. There's some people have been doing extensive raid testing with all the different classes played to their best. We're not those people, right? We test a little bit.
We test all the bosses.
People. Yeah, we tested all the bosses. We tested with most of these specs, but like, there are some guilds out there that have extensively stress tested all of these specs, but they're not allowed to talk about that publicly, right? These are the World First guilds. So the people that would know better than us aren't allowed to talk about it. So that's what you're getting.
So here's the deal too with our tier list. First off, Abberus, I would say it's a fairly single target heavy raid, especially compared to what we saw in Vault of the Incarnates. Vault of the Incarnates had a decent amount of like mixed cleave or AoE cleave, whereas Abberus is, a lot of the wall bosses or later bosses are single target focused, so that's going to be factoring in a lot more this tier. In addition to that, you have other things that we need to factor in, such as raid buffs, how often the spec is going to get played, that kind of thing. So, I mean, whenever we're looking at our tiers, S is generally like what you think of with an S tier spec. You're going to see 2 to 3 of them more often than not, especially in high-end mythic progression. These are specs that are going to perform super well. A is going to be, you're likely to see one of these in most, if not all, raid compositions. They are going to end up being pretty good. You're never really unhappy to see one of those in your raid compositions. Are they going to be present for everything in most situations? It's likely, but not always. B is the part where you're getting to like one of them on most fights, but 0 of them in some situations, depending on where their strengths or weaknesses are. And then, C and D is the, 0 to 1 are likely, and D is like, you're not going to see the spec more often than not.
Yeah. I think that's, again, this is aimed at like mythic progression early in the patch, right? So
there's things that change.
That in mind.
There's things that change with like class trinkets as well, and there's some stuff that can shift around as the patch goes on, and we are going to be continuing to update these tier lists on Wowhead in the written form, so go check that out. All right, I think a nice 4-minute introduction as to what our tier list is, and
let's start putting some things on the list before people click off.
Yeah, okay. We're gonna start with Mage. Right now, we have 3 specs of Mage, and one of them is going to be brought in spades because of Arcane Intellect. You're going to at least have one on your roster just generally. I think you and I have a little bit of a different read as to where the 3 Mage specs go.
Yeah, I think we both agree that you're probably not going to play Frost for most of the harder fights this tier. That's one that we're thinking is going to be... I think you might play this. You might be able to get away with this on some of the earlier fights. We'll probably be fine.
Yeah.
Definitely a consideration for maybe for like Assault of the Zakali, that kind of thing. But I don't think that this is going to be the premier choice for the later fights. I think you're looking for something with more of a bursty damage profile. I think it's more likely to be Fire than Arcane, but I know you think it's a little more likely to be Arcane than Fire. And I think you probably have more basis or more standing on this as a DPS player and having talked to more DPS players than I do. So
yeah, I think that it looks like it's going to be Arcane, but it's one of the situations that Fire has received a couple of buffs recently. On top of that, Fire is definitely going to be one of the better M plus DPS specs. The spec is very good whenever Cleave is involved in any situation. And I think that that's where the spec shines because of all of its single target damage gets converted to AoE. But these are a lot of single target bosses. These are like pure single target bosses in most situations. And that's where I think that Arcane is going to end up shining a little bit more than Fire. On top of that, they have a lot of burst inside of their cooldown intervals, which I typically tend to end up thinking that they're going to be better at than some of the other classes. I would put Arcane in A and Fire in B, but this is something that's like, it's pretty close. And the reason that Fire would be in B isn't necessarily because it's like bad, but it kind of gets outshined by Arcane in my mind. And that's kind of where I have stuff.
Yeah, I tend to think Arcane needs to be doing a lot more damage than Fire to be better. It did in Vault, and that was absolutely the case, and that was something I kind of missed in Vault, but like Fire has so much more mobility, survivability. It has this cleave, this execute movement that it can do while scorching that makes it really good on hard fights often. I think I would put Fire A, Arcane B, or I would have them both be in the same tier, either B or A. But I'm happy to defer to you on this one. I think that this is I
think that putting them all in B,
a big deal.
I feel like putting them all in B would be a mistake because I think that Frost is notably a little bit worse. Even though Frost isn't necessarily bad. Maybe all right, let's just put them both in A. It's probably fine.
All right, we'll check back on this though in a few weeks, and at some point, go tune into the Wowhead post and see if these one of these has moved.
One of these has moved. One of these is going to move.
It's pretty likely one of them will have moved.
We're hedging our bets here. All right, so S tier. Oh, I mean Warlocks. Sorry, I didn't mean to.
Okay.
All right, so I put 2 Warlock specs up in S tier. Now Demo's recently gotten nerfed, but even with that being the case, Warlocks during PTR testing have been some of the most ridiculous DPS specs in the game, except for Affliction, which is going to probably, at least in my mind, is going in C. So now Demo and Destro, I think that you can make an argument that Demo belongs in A, but as it currently stands from what we've seen from PTR testing, especially with how the fights are designed, these classes got so much from their tier set that they are gapping people by 30% DPS. It is ridiculous.
Yeah, these specs do really well. I mean, part of it was they do really well on testing because you have that Neltharion trinket that they just...
Yes.
Ooh, Demo especially, like that, the Neltharion's Call to Chaos or whatever, that thing is unreal on Demonology in particular. So, of course, that item's not going to be especially available early on in the patch unless you're, doing 9 splits and maining whichever Warlock you play in the split that it drops in, which, I know some guilds are going to be doing that, but obviously most of us are not going to be in a position to do that. Yeah, I think it's tough because, like, when we talked about S tier, it's like, oh, we expect this to be in on every pull, like multiples of these, but obviously... I think you're probably going to play either Demo or Destro.
You're not playing both,
fight.
Yeah.
You're like, it's going to be pretty rare. It does sometimes happen where you see like a split played by Warlocks in a like three of one and one of the other, or 2 of one and 2 of the other, that kind of thing. But yeah, I think like if there's only 2 Warlocks in for Mythic Prog, I would be surprised. I think 3 or more is where I would guess on number of Warlocks. If I had to guess, I would say I think Destro is probably going to be the spec on more fights than Demo, but
I agree.
I'm not sure. I don't think it would be like more than 80-20.
I tend to agree that I think it's going to be Destro more than Demo, but I think that moving Demo anything out of S tier is a bit against the law.
Again, it's one of the quirks of doing a tier list in a world where you play a class, not a spec, right? At the high level. So
okay, so I mean, Affliction ended up in C. Affliction was actually it started to get like ramp up as the patch progressed. I think it's just going to get outshined by the other 2 Warlock specializations ultimately. So you're very unlikely to see Affliction in any meaningful capacity. On top of that, they don't seem like they're like that great.
Yeah, it's another one of these things where it's like, if you imagine a world where Demo and Destro didn't exist, we'd be having a different conversation about AF, but I think it does get outshone by both of those specs in like 98% of damage profiles at this point.
That's ultimately the problem with them. Like
yeah. Which again, like that's one of the big challenges of doing a WoW tier list is like how do you factor in
what does representation mean?
Yeah, specs that are good on their own but are weaker versions of other specs in that class. I wouldn't blame any tier list creators out there for any choice they made there, and I feel like we'd make a different one every season in terms of how to handle that case. So
okay,
C sounds fine to me for AF.
With the 2 Death Knight specs, I think that Death Knight's actually going to end up being pretty decent as it currently stands. Let's talk about grip utility for a little bit. I think you can hit on that. Like, where exactly do you think grips are going to be required? Do you think that the DPS Death Knight is the likely candidate to bring grips whenever they are required?
So DPS Death Knights have A-Bomb Limb and Death Grip and 2 charges of Death Grip as well if they want it, but they don't have Gorfien's Grasp, right? The Mass Grip. Those 2 effects, though, like the A-Bomb Limb plus having 2 charges of Death Grip, it's pretty close, right? If you need stuff gripped, DPS DKs can definitely do it. You don't need a Blood DK for Mass Grip, which there have been some patches in the past where that was like a dramatically better effect than the single grips. So yeah, I mean, the fight that most strikes me as one where you might need grips is Zaskarn, because on Zaskarn you have these 4 like constructs that spawn all over the room, and you really want to grip them together, stun them, nuke them down, and get them killed. So I think that having 2 Death Knights of some flavor on that fight is going to be good. Whether that is coming from, you know, a tank and a DPS, 2 DPS, 2 tanks. I'm not sure yet what the best answer is going to be for like bleeding edge mythic prog, but I think that most guilds will benefit from having access to DKs on their roster. Yeah.
In regards to their DPS, it seems like Unholy is actually putting up pretty big numbers as it currently stands.
Unholy is a good PI target as well, right? And we haven't talked yet about the PI. The PI goes well on the Warlocks, of course. It goes well on the Evokers. It also goes very well on the Unholy DKs. Yeah. One thing we also haven't talked about is melee versus ranged in Abberus. That's maybe something to cover too.
We should have mentioned that at the top, yeah.
Because it seems, at least my impression from raid testing is that it seems more hostile to melee than the last few tiers have been. The last few tiers have been reasonably okay for melee, but this time it seems kind of like, do I really want to play more than 5 melee, for instance?
I think this is something that we're definitely going to see once the Racer World first starts. My read is that it's kind of balanced, but it's definitely less balanced than it has been in the past, and this is just like straight across the board. Obviously, we don't have things like Sarkareth testing and stuff like that, so I mean that's obviously going to factor in. They recently made Magmarax a little bit better for melee, as you're able to soak down the
you still have to do
puddles.
The soak one far away from the boss, right? So
allegedly. But at the same point, it seems like there's definitely going to be a bit more range than melee, and that's how it normally is in the past. Especially in Vault of the Incarnates is a bit more even, maybe even melee favored in some. As melee favored as you realistically can get, even. But I think Death Knight's actually a pretty good spot. I had Unholy in A and Frost in B. Did you agree? Disagree? Would you put Unholy in A maybe, or in B maybe?
I think that I would be surprised if people are playing multiple Unholies, I guess.
Okay, that's probably fair.
Prague. Yeah. Aside from potentially, maybe on Zaskarn you want 2 for grips or something. So I think this is probably I'd prefer. I mean, it is a case of if you look at its damage, it's great, right? It looks like it's one of the great DPS specs. But we're in a world now where of our 20 mythic raid spots, 14 or 15 are taken up by mandatory raid buffs, of which DK is bringing none. I
mean, this is one of the best melee though, right?
It is one of the best melee, but you need to bring a melee to give you a battle shout. You need to bring a melee to give you a mystic touch, right? You need to bring a melee to give you a chaos brand. If we're only playing 5 melee, you've got 2 flex spots to throw around. Rep pallies are fighting hard for those. Rogues, you need to bring a rogue for one of them as well for your atrophic poison, right? So all of a sudden, the number of slots that an Unholy DK can take up, especially if I'm right that you don't really want more than the 5th melee, and maybe even that 5th melee is a liability this tier, then it just becomes really hard to play
top of
that
B.
many copies of them. But I wouldn't mind it being an A. It's just a question of what the likelihood is of the melee being playable.
So it sounds like we're battling between top of A, bottom of A,
top of B, or bottom of A. Yeah.
I mean, it's not the same as Frost. Frost is decent. But I think that Unholy is going to outperform it just DPS wise, and so then it's a question of why would you bring a Frost DK over an Unholy Death Knight?
Frost will the breath cleave damage profile is still very valuable.
Good. Yeah,
that's really good. It's just I don't see any fights aside from maybe Assault of the Zakali where it's going to do extremely well. On that damage pattern, and I mean maybe again we haven't tested Sarkareth, so you never know.
I'll leave this in top of B for now.
Okay.
I think that you realistically could go either way. All right, we got the Hunter specializations. So one of these specs is broken, very good, and that spec is surprisingly enough Marksmanship. So one of the things that Marksmanship can do in 10.1 is have very high uptime on True Shot, and that allows them, if they're gambling and they high roll, to have somewhere in the order I've seen some in 3-minute pulls, somewhere as high as 85% uptime on True Shot. Now, obviously, this requires them to get very lucky to have that high of uptime on True Shot. But I think just in general, their single target damage has improved dramatically from last patch to this patch. And that puts them at a point where they do a large amount of damage, contending with some of the best specs, especially whenever they are high rolling a bit.
The most recent couple of class tuning changes have included some nerfs to True Shot uptime, I think, as well, right?
Yeah, but it's still very good.
Still very good? Okay, awesome. Yeah. I mean, Hunter looked really good in the raid testing whenever our Hunter was awake for raid testing, which admittedly was a solid minority of the raid testings, but he was top damage whenever he was.
Okay. For the other two Hunter specs, I have Serve in C and BM in D. And so
yeah, Serve was actually looking like it was doing some sick damage. They nerfed its set bonus, and then they nerfed its set bonus again.
Yes.
And now I think its damage is probably like good. But the problem with Serve Hunters is if their damage is good,
yes,
they don't bring a raid buff. They are a Hunter in melee range of the boss. Like these are Serve Hunter needs to be doing great damage to be fighting for a raid spot in a world of, you know, the raid buff situation and the fact that Hunters, the other Hunter specs get to not stand next to the boss. They get to stand far away from the boss. And that's,
I agree.
You know, better generally.
I think for the reason that BM is D, first off, I believe that they are the lowest simming spec in the game currently. Now, that's not always indicative of how a class is going to perform, but it's definitely a red flag, especially for Beast Mastery Hunter. On top of that, Beast Mastery Hunter is going to, I believe it's going to get outshined by marksmanship by a significant amount. On top of that, no raid buff. If it's below average DPS, and it's going to just be, I mean, it seems like it's a bunch of red flags in a row where this is a spec that you're going to see marksmanship only almost exclusively this tier, and BM very irregularly, if never. And that's like, oh, yeah. Okay. So that's why that ends up in D.
BM can be really nice to play whenever you can, right? Because it's just like, it's so comfy. You get to move, you get to but MM has a lot of good tools for movement as well now these days as well. And I don't think any of the fights are really set up to justify playing BM at a, 10% or whatever DPS loss to MM.
Yep.
Or potentially more. So
I tend to agree with that.
I think this is probably fair. I think this is definitely one of the specs. Like the two non-MM Hunter specs are definitely two that I would hope to see some buffs coming to. Although, yeah, I mean, the fact they've been nerfing survival over and over again, maybe we're just way off, and maybe survival is actually still going to be fine because, surely they wouldn't just nerf it twice in a row if it was not going to be doing good damage to be brought, right? That'd be so messed up.
I don't know. We'll see. All right, Shadow Priest. Shadow is one that I think you actually are going to have one for a lot of fights this tier, but I think that this is just going to result in Shadow being in B tier. I don't see a world where you're ever realistically playing two of them. I think that like Shadow excels at 2-target cleave more often than not. It's one of the best specs in the game at 2-target cleave, even them in Destruction Warlock. Their single target's actually not bad. I think their damage is overall pretty good, and this is kind of funny because if we do the DPS and plus tier list, you see Shadow at the top, and it's very, very good at that. But for raid, there's a lot of single target fights. It seems like it's going to be decent enough to where you can play one every fight, but I don't see you playing two to push them into A.
Yeah, it is another power infusion, and you'll note one of the things about a lot of the specs in our A and S tiers is a lot of them really do like power infusions.
I agree with that, yeah.
So that's another nice little bit of value that doesn't show up on the Shadow Priest damage chart. I'm comfortable with B as well, but of the specs in B tier, if you told me that like one of the 4 that we had so far was showing up in multiples, that my money would be on Shadow Priest so far.
It's difficult to stack this spec is something that's also kind of
because you're playing. It's another spec that technically it does have a raid buff, right? But usually it's not hard to have a priest already as one of your healers. Mm-hmm. So filling your flex spots with Shadow Priests is like, you adding the 4th or 5th PI or whatever is finding a much less good target than the 1st, 2nd, and 3rd did.
I'd rather fill my flex spots with this sucker right here.
Yeah, I mean it is tanky, right? But it's it's definitely not as tanky as the Warlocks. It doesn't have an immunity, which can matter for some fights as well. It's not an especially mobile class either. You think about Razageth, right? One of the difficulties on Razageth was counting how many priests you had, and then counting how many evokers you had, and hoping that the number of evokers was more than the number of priests, because otherwise you were going to be in trouble.
Yeah. Okay. Feral and Balance. We can start with Feral. I think this spec kind of stinks.
Yeah. So Feral's had some interesting changes in this patch cycle. They've kind of reworked Berserk.
Yes.
They've got a tier set that's kind of interesting as well. I feel like this one might land somewhere like Survival Hunter, where it's like the spec is doing good damage. But for you to bring a Feral Druid, again, we're talking about maybe, if I'm right, say 5 melee specs, of which like 3 or 4 of them are filled up with your raid buffs, with raid buff classes. So you're fighting for 1 or 2 flex spots against unholy DKs, against ret paladins, against like another rogue or something. Those are very competitive spots, and the Feral Druid, aside from damage, is bringing Stampeding Roar.
I mean, they can bring Mark of the Wild, yeah.
Mark of the Wild, although the thing about Mark of the Wild is like you so often are going to have another Druid in one of the other specs of it, which
tend to agree. Yeah, I think
obviously if you don't have one of those, then yeah, the Feral shoots up in value. But
I additionally think that Feral is more of an AoE specialist more often than not, and like with the amount of single target bosses, it's like if there were more AoE bosses, I think that there's a world where you bump this up to be. Say if we have to redo Vault of the Incarnates today, because there was a lot of AoE bosses in Vault of the Incarnates that also valued mixed cleave in some capacity. I think that Feral's probably in B there, but I think with the amount of single target fights here, it's like, this is a bit tough to get out of C. Additionally, this is a spec that's not like uber popular or anything, so I think you're even less likely to see a bunch of them being played.
Yeah, I mean, I think that it's in a better spot than Feral was for a lot of the previous expansions.
I agree.
If you're in a guild where you have a Feral Druid, it is a lot less of a liability, even if you're like a cutting edge guild, than it was in BFA, for instance. So I think that's symptomatic of like, again, the gap between S and D in our list has gotten smaller than it used to be.
Yes, we used to have
I do
some
think
real...
that this still does belong down here. Yeah, which is, I mean, I like Feral. Feral's one of my favorite specs. I play a lot of Feral.
It's fun. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
So.
Balance, I have this at top of B. I think that like in general the damage profile that it brings kind of sucks, but the damage profile that it brought in Vault of the Incarnates was also bad, and you saw them in multiples. I think that you're going to see 1 minimum. I think there's a chance that you see 2 in some compositions, but it's going to definitely be tough to see multiple. It's like the spec is good at AoE, the spec is very bad at single target is generally what the drawbacks are, but I think that they're your mark of the wild holder.
Yeah, balance is interesting. I think if I had to guess how many are showing up, I'd be between 1 and 2.
Yeah.
I think I would maybe bet on 2 over 1.
So you want to put this in
I'm
A?
fine with top of B. Yeah, I'm fine with top of B, bottom of A, whatever.
It's definitely close. I could see it being bottom of A. I'm down to leave it here. Historically, the spec is one that is very valuable in raid, and to the point where you see multiple of them even whenever their damage kind of sucks.
Where it looks like it should be bad, and then it's just always worth, like, you're just looking at your 18th, 19th, and 20th spots, and you're like, you know what would be nice here? Like, let's just throw in another Druid, right?
Yep.
Like, it's not going to die. It's going to bring Innervate. It's got cooldowns. Even if it's like overall isn't good, it's got good AoE cooldowns or good single target and cooldowns as well, right? That let me do this burst phase well.
Mm-hmm.
You know, it's mobile. There's a lot of good stuff going for it. So again, I wouldn't be surprised if there was only 1 showing up and we'd rather have it in B, but I think it's a little bit more likely that you see 2 in top guilds.
It normally does all the jobs in your raid. Like it's a spec that gets allocated.
Doer.
Yeah, it's the spec that gets allocated to that.
That's one of the downsides, by the way, of like Arcane versus Fire, is the Fire Mage can be a job doer.
Oh,
the Arcane Mage often cannot be a job doer.
That's totally reasonable. Okay, Elemental Shaman. If we recorded this a week ago, I would have argued hard for Ellie and A. Their single target dam was insane. Now, they're very sad. They got recently absolutely blasted with their tier set nerfs, and I now have them in B because of it. Now, is it because they're bad? No. We're definitely not likely to see multiple of them, though.
Are we likely to see one
I think
of them?
Good. If you have a good Ellie player.
Gun to your head right now, and they were like, what is the number of elemental shamans in the world first kill this tier? What number are you saying?
0, because there are no elemental shamans on either competitive roster. But that's not because elemental is bad. It's because it's like the lack of Ellie players. Yeah, it's not a spec.
I don't really buy that. I mean, I think that like there are people on those rosters that would play Ellie if they thought it was correct.
Not if it's just medium though.
Well, yeah, but like they will play the best 20.
So you're arguing that this goes in C? Stuff. Oh wow.
I kind of think it should. Yeah, I mean, like, I think it was a case of like it was maybe high B, low A, and then they nerfed it, and now what's the point of this thing, right? Like
their dam is insane.
Yeah, its AoE is very good, but like this tier does not look like it's one where there. I mean, you want to top parse on Assault of the Zakali, sure, but
all right,
what do you get for doing that, right? You get a little ribbon and probably not even any All-Star points, because the Warcraft logs isn't going to put that thing on All-Star points, right? So,
all right, I'll concede C. I'll concede C for this.
I mean, it's tough because like I love Elemental Shaman. Elemental Shaman is also one of my favorite specs. I played it for 2 tiers back in BFA. This spec is really fun. It's really cool. But like, how do you justify playing it in a world where there's these other specs if it's not doing like,
by the way,
sick nasty damage?
A little bit of a preview. This spec actually very high, a lot higher in our M+ DPS tier list.
Yeah, the AoE is great on this spec, but this tier doesn't look like it's again, aside from maybe it's nice to have it on Zaskarn for throwing down some earthquakes and blowing up the ads when you grip them together. Maybe maybe it'll probably be very good on Assault of the Zakali as well. Maybe it'll be good on Forgotten Experiments. Do some nice flame shotgun. Okay. But I don't think it's going to be good on the last like 4 fights of the tier, which are all look like they are either single target only or primarily single target.
Yeah, that's the problem. It's like there's so many single target plays this tier, and you're like, oh well, I guess only one damage profile matters. All right, Havoc DH. This was also one that I think moved for me relative to class tuning recently. This thing, I thought you were looking maybe at a Vengeance Demon Hunter tier, because this thing looked like it was bad. I'm thinking that they're the raid buff now, so I'm putting them in B, yeah?
I still think you might play a Vengeance Demon Hunter over a Havoc Demon Hunter. Like, if you think about it, it's like, oh yeah, I can clear up a spot for an extra Ret Pally or an extra Rogue or an extra, melee DPS or whatever by dropping my Havoc and playing a Vengeance instead. That's definitely still something I think might happen, but I do think it's probably more likely than not that you'll just play one Havoc, yeah.
Their damage, primarily on single target, does not look that great. It's definitely looked the worst.
Describe it as anemic, yeah.
Yeah, it's the worst that I've seen Havoc in a while. I wouldn't mind seeing them get a little bit buffed damage-wise, but
they did just buff them on PTR, and they buffed them, like you said, I think from like C. Maybe it was honestly still B, because maybe honestly people just didn't. A lot of people still wouldn't run a Vengeance, but
I mean, it's the raid buff. So I mean, we're here. Yeah. You're gonna see one of them, I think, in the raid. Just bring Chaos Braid. You're never seeing two of them, I don't think, at its current state, though.
I think I agree with that. Yeah.
Okay, so the rogues, dude, rogue is in such a weird spot. Their damage not particularly great. They've been undertuned. We've seen a few rounds of buffs recently to the rogue class in general. On top of that, there's been some stuff with like bug fixes and tier set stuff. I heard that Kingsbane is still bugged, even though they stated that it was fixed. And the Outlaw 2 piece is apparently doing less damage than intended.
The Outlaw set bonus has been oscillating between doing 4 times more and 4 times less damage than it's supposed to be doing.
Yes.
From PTR build to PTR build. Yeah, it's been pretty wild ride.
And so for a while, rogues were claiming that they were not going to be played at all, outside of just one for the Atrophic Poison. I actually tended to agree with them. Now, with the recent buffs to Assassination, I had this thing placed in A. It did get very large buffs, like 20% to Shiv, but like, is it going to be like great? I don't know. I think that there's a world where you play 2 rogues on some fights. I think that one is almost certainly going to be played, and I think the Assassination rogue is definitely going to be the best one as it currently stands.
Yeah, I think I like Assassination as well, just looking at the damage profiles of the last few fights so far.
Yeah.
I think it's going to be your best bet, especially when we're talking about a melee unfriendly tier, which I think this tier will be. Again, that's a lot of this tier list, a lot of my thoughts on this tier list are kind of predicated on that one assumption. So if that domino falls, a lot of this is going to look real stupid. But if that's true, if there are fights where, you're forced out of melee very often, that is a really awful situation to be playing sub and to a lesser extent outlaw. It's really not bad at all to be playing Assassination. Like if you're on a fight where you have to dip out of the boss's range for 5 seconds, as long as it's not in your cooldowns, you're losing like 2 DPS or something playing Assassination. So I think Assassination is likely to be the play for the later bosses this year. Yeah.
This sub spec sucks. Like their damage not very good.
I would be surprised if this was seeing play over Sin. I think you play Sin on most fights and Outlaw on some from how it's currently looking. Yeah.
And that's kind of why I have Outlaw. Yep. I think that Sin and A, Outlaw B, Sub C to differentiate them, I think makes the most sense for me.
Yeah, that works for me. Again, this is another class where how good one of the specs is going to affect where the others go on this list. So
I mean, we need one minimum. So
yeah, and you do, of course, Atrophic Poison. That is a raid buff, a very powerful raid buff that you cannot play without if you're trying to get pre-nerf boss kills.
Enhance. If we're bringing 4 melee, we may as well bring 5. This thing goes into A, yeah.
So yeah, I mean, Enhance, it's good.
It's good. It's good on its own merits too, I think, is what the big deal is.
Yeah, it enhances the damage of your other melee, especially if you're playing stuff like Darm's Warrior in particular. But it is still good, kind of just with most melee. If you're playing Prot Warriors as well, that's actually one of the most DPS gained by a Wind Fury Totem is the Prot Warrior too. I wouldn't be shocked if guilds shaved down to 1 or 0 Enhance.
Oh, interesting.
But I think 1 is more likely than 0. I don't know if 2 is more likely than 0.
2 is 2 more likely than 0? I don't know. The gamble spec that they've been playing, even whenever they're not high rolling, their damage is really good. And then whenever they get their procs kind of similar to MM Hunter, they're actually like topping the meters even over the Warlocks in some situations. And you're like, this is actually kind of a crazy spec. So,
again, like if there's 7 melee spots, for instance, then that's working out really well. But in a world where like you've got a lot of pressure competing for very few spots total.
I think this is definitely one of the best melee, and I think that
I'm fine with it in A. I do think 1 is the most likely number that you're going to see in top comps. I think 0 is more likely than 2, but I I'm not confident in that.
I don't even think I just don't even believe that 0 is likely. I just also don't think that 2 is likely. I think this is like a one spec wonder.
It may just be like 90% that it's 1, in which
yeah,
case
it's just one spec wonder. I think Ret Pally kind of a similar spot with Enhance, where it's just like a one spec wonder. Now they reworked Ret Paladin and Retribution Aura significantly, to the point where you want one carrier of Devo Aura and one carrier of Retribution Aura, and the Ret Pally is in the best state that I've seen it in a hot minute.
Yeah. So from the raid buff perspective, you know, you want 2 paladins out of your 20 players.
Correct.
Which is good news for Ret, but sort of bad news for Ret is that Holy and Prot Paladin also both look good. So
I agree with that, yes.
If you're already playing 2 paladins between your tanks and healers, then all of a sudden your Ret Paladin's not bringing a raid buff, right?
I do think that maybe the Prot Paladin's the one that slides out, and then you get other raid buffs from your tanks.
Maybe, yeah. If you're trying to cut your, you know, if you don't want to play a monk, so you play a brewmaster, right?
Yeah. Yes. This thing.
that sort of thing. Maybe you get your other raid buffs, but on the other hand, Prot Paladin looks really good, and you know, Holy Paladin also. I think having one of those
on its own merits, this is like top of B, bottom A. I think that I could go either way.
Yeah.
The damage is good.
It does do a lot of damage.
Yes. The problem is you're not ranking specs based purely off their damage. There are situations that Ret actually can be more valuable than just the damage it provides, with things such as Blessing of Protection and Bubble. But in reality, there weren't a lot of situations where we saw those things being like the most useful.
Yeah, Bop, like, I mean, it's sort of nice, like on Magmarax's knockbacks.
It's good on Zaskarn.
You could save somebody. On Zaskarn, yeah, bubbling is nice. I guess Bubble and Bop are both really good for that, but I
for the bombs,
the tanks will probably be able to handle that without too much outside assistance, but it is some nice extra value. But I do think that the Ret Paladin is closer to being brought just for its DPS than the other things. I think I'd rather put it in B, because if it is a melee unfriendly tier, it's just really hard to put all these melee up in A.
This is what we're calculating it based off of, right? If it's like a fine tier for melee, this goes into bottom of A, and it's like actually a really good thing. You end up seeing one of them on pretty much every single fight. They're them on their merits alone, kind of similar to Unholy DK. It's like if this tier is fine for melee or it's balanced for melee, then I think that both of these specs go here. But in like a world where it's, you know, either medium to unfriendly to melee, then it goes in B, and it's like,
Yeah, I think Enhance, Unholy, and Ret are all kind of in that same spot. Where
I think that Enhance is a little bit better, but yeah,
that's fair. Yeah,
we're really.
It is right on the borderline. That's for sure.
I mean, this one at least brings a raid buff, so I think you could.
Yeah, which is potentially valuable. Though I do think you're more often than not going to have 2 other paladins from the other roles.
We'll put this in B, and we'll just put this in top.
It's tough, yeah.
Windwalker Monk recently got buffed. This thing kind of still stinks.
Yeah, they buffed it out of F to D, it looked like in Raid. Like that. Windwalker, they changed its set bonus. So for a while in testing, it looked reasonably okay, because the set bonus like amped your Shadow Flame damage, and you could just play trinkets that did Shadow or Fire damage and be okay.
Mm-hmm.
But then they ripped off that Band-Aid, and there turned out to be a gushing wound underneath the Band-Aid. And they didn't really put anything back on.
So
then they buffed Tiger Bomb by 15%, and Windwalkers are still just down horrendous for single target damage.
Definitely one of the dumber tier sets that has been designed for them, right? That's one of the reasons that's also they were getting no favors with their tier.
Yeah, it's gone through a couple iterations. Let me go see what it is.
It was previously a tier set where it involved like their melee attacks,
right?
And that was one that was like a lot of people were questioning it, because Windwalker cancels their auto attacks a lot. They're one of the lowest damage.
Yeah, because a lot of your abilities reset your swing timer on this deck, which it was really cursed to have something that like keyed off of your autos as a result. Yeah, I think this is a spec that they need to look at like how this spec works and rethink it, because this problem happens for Windwalkers. It feels like half the tiers Windwalkers are just not doing any damage, and they don't scale with secondary stats very well at all, and they just kind of are at the mercy of like a good Band-Aid fix being applied every tier, it feels like.
Yeah, I mean, I think that this like putting it in D is almost us cementing that Brewmaster or Mistweaver are going to be pretty high.
Yeah, I suspect that most groups are going to plan to at least be able to play a Brew or a Mistweaver. Yeah,
Brew. I mean, Brew seems like it's pretty good, but we can talk about that later. All right.
Yeah, we'll talk about those in the other tier list.
Yep, we got DPS Warriors next, and I have both these in B. I think they're both like. Am I like, I think you want one of them for Battle Shout. I think that neither one of them is like significantly better than the other. They're good at like kind of different things.
Yeah, I suspect Arms is going to be the one you'll play on more of the later boss fights.
I agree with that, yeah.
I'm fine with both of them being tiered into B. And I do think you're going to want to play one DPS warrior.
Neither of them are,
because I don't think you're really going to want to play prot warrior.
Neither of them are so bad that I'm like, oh yeah, you're definitely playing this one over the other. I think if there was like a large divide between the two of them, one of them goes into B, one of them goes into C, just because there's like a differentiator. And this,
yeah, I mean, I think you'll play Fury on some fights.
That's what I'm saying. Yeah, it's like I think that Fury actually does get played some places.
Maybe not though. Arms, if I had to guess, I would guess Arms maybe like 70-30 or something, maybe even 80-20. But I don't know. I'm not super up on the warrior stuff. That's just what it looked like from testing to me.
Okay, we got that Dern Dragon as the last thing to rank, and this
Saving
thing,
the best for last.
Yeah, this thing went from mid to very, very good this tier. Their damage and their force set has provided a significant amount of power to this spec. I'm thinking like top of A. They're not in the Warlock tier, but they are. If you could make an argument that they're S, I would buy it. But I'm thinking they're like top of A. They are very good.
Yeah, like my guild has one dev main, and I'm thinking about like, do we want to make somebody else play one, right? Like do we want to make 2 other people play one? Like, is this
okay? Because
the spec, it looks like it is piping on the damage meters right now, and that's even, dude. Have you heard the rumors?
What's the word on the street?
The Evoker legendary rumors. It's been swirling around.
Well, if they get a legendary and they're better than they were during testing, then I won't know what to think, because that spec was crazy.
Yeah, if this ends up being true, it would probably be a month or 2 in anyways that you could get it or something. But yeah, this spec does just look pretty great.
You go with top of A for this guy?
I'm good with top of A. Yeah, I think.
All right. Okay. I think that's going to conclude our 10.1 raid DPS tier list. Again, we're going to be continuing to edit this in its written form on Wowhead. So as the tier progresses, as class tuning happens, as rogues inevitably get their bugs fixed, we're probably going to move some specs around. I think in 10.0, we ended up moving some things. More often than not, there was not much that moved more than one place. Yeah. Anyways,
our 10.0 tier list was actually really close. Like we only had to move like one spec for non-class tuning reasons, and then obviously whenever they do class tuning, we got to move stuff. But you can't avoid that.
Yep, that's how it be. And so we will see you guys in the next video. Hope you guys all have a great rest of your day. We'll see you guys later.